I spent years flying the most important journeys in the world, carrying kings, queens, and heads of state. I had the discipline, the prestige, and everyone's trust. But in the middle of roaring engines and glittering crowns, I discovered there was a silence inside me that no protocol could drown out. In that moment, I realized that all my medals were hiding something I never had the courage to admit, an empty soul crying out for answers. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 50 years old and I live in the United States. I grew up believing that serving the flag and the crown was the greatest honor anyone could achieve. For years, my life was defined by spotless uniforms, medals across my chest, and the confidence of the most powerful people on earth. But even surrounded by luxury and recognition, something was missing, something I couldn't name. Only later did I understand that the uncomfortable silence was, in fact, a calling. Before I continue with my story of conversion, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. After so many years of military training and unbreakable discipline, being at the controls of the British Royal Household's flights seemed like the crowning moment of a career. Flawless takeoffs from Windsor, careful landings in Balmoral, and secret itineraries to Sandringham placed me at the heart of a system where nothing could go wrong. The environment was marked by rigid formality, every second calculated, every movement rehearsed, every word measured. I flew with precision, yet inside I was facing turbulence that never appeared on the radar. On the surface, everything sparkled with grandeur. Scarlet carpets unrolled on hidden runways, receptions with officers lined like statues, banquets that looked like they had been pulled from a Baroque painting. To the outside world I was privileged, a witness to a realm few could even imagine, but behind speeches about regional stability and humanitarian missions, the reports I read in the co-pilot's seat carried cold numbers: civilian casualties, destroyed cities, displaced populations. That contrast began corroding what I believed was my mission. It felt like living on two separate floors of the same building. Upstairs, the gilded halls where kings and princes discussed alliances, as casually as choosing a banquet menu. Downstairs, within me, a growing unease, a noise that never faded. I was surrounded by power, but at the same time I felt increasingly small. I began to notice that while smiling faces toasted to peace, I carried on my wings the weight of invisible lives. It was in this setting, where I seemed to have everything, that something began to move in an unexpected way. 3 signs would mark my path, each appearing on different flights, as if the sky itself had decided to tear through protocol and speak to me. The first came at the very moment I thought I was living at the height of my stability. Everything was under control. Instruments functioning perfectly, itineraries exact, discreet applause from important passengers. And then, suddenly, a silent presence broke what I had always considered unshakable. The contrast could not have been greater. On the outside, the pomp of an ancient monarchy. Inside, my soul beginning to bend, recognizing that something essential was slipping away. I didn't know it yet, but the path of faith was about to cross the cockpit and forever change my course. That morning over Scotland seemed like just another among countless others. The weather was perfect, the aircraft responded with its usual precision, and reports confirmed clear skies. Everything was unfolding as expected. Yet in a matter of seconds, routine was interrupted by something no aviation manual could explain. The instruments began showing small discrepancies, as if each system were telling a different version of the same route. GPS, artificial horizon, even the altitude sensors showed signs of misalignment. For any pilot, that was the beginning of a serious emergency. But strangely, nothing became a full-blown failure. 90 seconds of strangeness passed. No alarms, no technical explanation. Air traffic control registered no anomalies, and the flight recorder showed everything normal. But for me, normal had just been suspended. Through the side window, I noticed a bright glow emerging near the left wing. At first I thought it was sunlight reflecting, but I dismissed it quickly. The sun's position didn't match, and the light was different, almost tangible. It expanded in the shape of a halo, outlined as if drawn by invisible hands in geometric strokes like living calligraphy. It was golden, dense, pulsating, keeping pace with the plane and holding a constant distance. It felt as if that presence was not just moving with us, but watching us. I called the co-pilot and asked if he saw anything unusual. He immediately replied, "Clear skies, Captain." I asked the support crew, and they all gave the same response. To them, nothing existed but the uniform blue of the heavens. The strangeness deepened. Why could only I see that light? As I tried to rationalize it, an impression filled the cockpit. It wasn't external sound, it didn't come from the radios, but it echoed within me like a crystalline whisper, a single word, clear and irresistible: peace. It was so real that my muscles relaxed, as if years of tension had drained from me in seconds. It was impossible to link that moment to fatigue or illusion. The experience had weight, consistency, and impact. The light stayed beside the aircraft until, without fanfare, it slowly dissolved like liquid gold, spreading through the air until it vanished completely. Immediately after, the instruments resynchronized as if nothing had happened. No malfunctions, no error codes, only normality restored. I kept the episode to myself. I knew that if I reported it officially, I risked being labeled fatigued or unstable. But inside me, something had been recorded more strongly than any electronic log. There are realities that surpass human control. And on that flight over Scotland, I had touched one of them. Life inside the palaces was a continuous spectacle. Carpets rolled out, discreet orchestras playing in the background, banquets planned down to the smallest detail. I walked through corridors where every gesture carried centuries of tradition. At first glance, it was impossible not to be impressed by the perfection of that machinery. Everything seemed designed to sustain the image of stability and power. But in the breaks, when the doors closed and the conversations lost their ceremonial tone, the atmosphere changed. I heard ministers and advisors discussing humanitarian corridors as if they were nothing more than routes on a map. Words like collateral damage appeared in reports that quietly made their way into my hands. There was no orchestra playing there, no eloquent speeches, only numbers and cold statistics. And behind those numbers, I knew there were faces, families, children who would never be mentioned. It was in that contrast that my uniform began to feel heavy. On the outside, I adjusted the knot of my tie, kept my posture flawless, and embodied the image of trust they expected from me. On the inside, I slowly loosened the knots that tied me to the comfort of justifications. Every glass raised in festive toasts seemed to clink against my conscience. With each toast, I wondered if the peace being celebrated there wasn't in fact built on the suffering of those who would never step foot in those halls. Laughter especially hurt me. It was carefree, almost trivial, coming from men who had just signed decisions capable of ruining nations. A kind of laughter that clashed with the images I carried in memory. Fields reduced to ashes seen from above, columns of smoke rising where entire villages once stood. I tried to ignore it, but the comparison was inevitable. While they spoke of strategic moves, I remembered the times I saw bodies being pulled from rubble by frantic rescuers. It was in that environment that the question began to grow in me, persistent, unsettling. What if the throne was nothing more than a stage, carefully built to cover human fragility? What if true leadership wasn't in golden symbols, but in the ability to hear the voice that echoes within the soul? That thought followed me like a shadow. The prestige that once filled me with pride now weighed me down, as if every medal on my chest were made of lead. I understood that I could follow two paths: continue serving the mere appearance of greatness, or seek the meaning that was beginning to whisper in moments of silence. And though I didn't yet have the courage to say it out loud, inside me the choice was already being made. State flights continued with their flawless rhythm, but my expression could no longer hide the unease. Between one mission and another, I started spending more time alone in the hangar at Northolt, where the aircraft rested under the cold glow of industrial lights. It was there that a single detail changed the course of my life. Yusuf, the systems engineer responsible for checking the electronics on my panel, was a reserved man. He rarely involved himself in conversations, speaking only what was necessary to guarantee the plane's safety. But that afternoon, while making routine adjustments, he lifted his eyes and noticed the weight of my silence. Without hesitation, he said, "When the cockpit goes quiet, some finally begin to hear what has always been there." His words hung in the air, as though they weren't just technical, but a message. I forced a brief smile, trying to hide my discomfort, but he went on. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small navy blue volume. "Maybe this will help," he said softly, placing the object in my hands as though he were giving me something more precious than any spare part. It was a translation of the Quran in English. I received the book with the same care I would give to an emergency manual. Part of me wanted to refuse, fearing that some curious colleague might notice. But another part of me knew that gesture carried a different weight. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't persuasion. It was simply an honest offer of an answer for a heart that could no longer satisfy itself. I quickly tucked the copy into my document folder, between checklists and flight reports, as if it were just another piece of paperwork. I didn't want to raise suspicion, but deep down I knew that book was unlike anything I had ever been handed. It was discreet and at the same time explosive. That night, once home, as I opened the folder on the table, my eyes went straight to the blue cover. I touched it with hesitation, like someone afraid of triggering something. I didn't open the book, not yet. I simply placed it beside the bed, but just by being there, so close, it changed the atmosphere of the room. Yusuf never insisted, never asked later if I had read it. He simply carried on with his quiet work, as if he knew that some seeds sprout at the right time. And I, though reluctant, began to realize that I was no longer just a pilot of royal routes. I was about to embark on a far deeper journey, one that appeared in no flight plan. The mission in Marrakesh seemed like just another chapter in the royal family's extensive calendar. The entourage disembarked to official honors, flags waving in the wind, journalists lined up behind barricades. For me, the task was to ensure every aerial transfer went off without error. And that day, inside the sealed cockpit, surrounded by armor that blocked out any external noise, everything should have sounded like absolute silence. But the silence wasn't absolute. While checking the internal line used for the checklist, something unexpected happened. A voice in Arabic began to echo through the cockpit speakers. It wasn't static, it wasn't technical interference. It had cadence, rhythm, precise intonation, recitation. At first I froze, thinking some external channel had infiltrated the system. I touched the controls, checked the indicators. Nothing. All parameters were normal. The voice, however, remained. Melodic, clear, steady, as though it had been recorded for that exact moment. I looked at the co-pilot, waiting for some reaction. He remained unbothered, focused on his own procedures. I whispered, "Do you hear that?" He lifted his eyes, confused. "Hear what? Everything's normal." It was as if only I had access to that call. The contrast was overwhelming. There, behind reinforced glass and airtight panels, I was hearing a voice that pierced the impossible. I didn't rationally understand the words, but each syllable fell on me like drops over embers. I felt something like invisible water, extinguishing old fires I carried in my chest. The exhaustion of past battles, the pain of memories of devastated cities, the coldness of military reports, all seemed wrapped in a peace that didn't ask permission. The recitation lasted as long as a full checklist, perhaps 2 minutes. When it ended, the system returned to the usual silence of the cockpit. I ran quick checks, rereading indicators, but nothing was logged. For the aircraft, nothing had happened. For me, however, everything had. That night, back at the hotel reserved for officers, I carried the strange unease with me. The room was luxurious. Heavy curtains blocked the streetlights. The staff had left fresh fruit on the table, but I couldn't rest. The echo of that voice stayed with me, as though etched into the walls of my mind. My eyes fell on the suitcase. Among folders and documents, the copy Yusuf had handed me at Northolt still rested there. I sat in the armchair and, without planning, opened the book for the first time. The pages fell directly to Surah Al-Ikhlas, short, clear, luminous verses. Say, He is Allah the One, Allah the Absolute. He begets not, nor was he begotten, and there is none comparable to him. There was no excess, no unnecessary ornament, only precision. Each word seemed to slice the air with the sharpness of a blade. What surprised me most was the absence of spectacle. There were no shouts, no theatrics. Only simplicity, a declaration of oneness that stood on its own without needing external support. There was truth here that didn't need to scream. It imposed itself by its own weight. As I read, I realized those short sentences disarmed something I had built for years like a fortress, the need for complex justifications for everything. I had lived believing that greatness came from power, prestige, and the golden symbols of royalty. But now, before words so direct, I understood that true greatness does not hide behind crowns, but in the invisible essence that upholds the universe. I closed the book slowly, as if guarding a dangerous secret. I knew that if anyone discovered what I had just read, my position would be questioned. Yet there was no turning back. The recitation that had pierced armored glass had made it clear. A personal call was happening, and I was the one it was addressed to. That night in Marrakesh, the whole city seemed asleep under the heat of the night. But inside my room, in the thickest silence, I had awakened to something that could not be undone. The return to London was supposed to mean rest, a pause between diplomatic commitments and international flights. Buckingham welcomed me as always. Polished marble corridors, halls filled with ancestral portraits, guards standing immobile, sustaining the aura of an eternal monarchy. But that day, it wasn't the gilded walls or the flawless uniforms that marked me. It was the quiet garden that became a mirror of what I could no longer ignore. I was walking along one of the outer paths when my eyes were drawn to an improbable scene. The leaves of several trees began to move in unison, yet the wind did not explain it. It was a calm afternoon, with only a faint breeze. Still before me the branches bent as if obeying an invisible command, and the leaves arranged themselves into a clear pattern. Immediately I understood what I was seeing. The word unity appeared with unmistakable clarity, as if the garden itself had turned into a living page. My body reacted before my mind. A chill ran up my spine and my heart raced. I looked around for witnesses, but no one seemed to notice. The nearby aides were busy on their phones, laughing and exchanging remarks about meetings and negotiations that would affect entire countries. For them, nothing had changed. For me, the ground beneath my feet was no longer the same. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to rationalize it. It could have been nothing more than imagination, a coincidence of shapes. But the sharpness of the design left me no room for doubt. It was a sign directed at me, without intermediaries. And deep down I already knew. It wasn't the first and it wouldn't be the last. At that moment a disturbing thought crossed my mind. If Buckingham's walls represented centuries of accumulated power, that simple garden had offered me more truth in minutes than all the official speeches I had heard in years of service. The crown shone inside, but my conscience burned outside. I realized with uncomfortable clarity that my entire biography was in need of editing. It wasn't only about my work, but about the very essence of what I called life. As I walked back through the side corridor, I caught snatches of the aides discussing geopolitical strategies. Their tone was light, almost playful. They laughed about alliances that would destabilize regions, treated entire populations like game pieces. That laughter echoed painfully inside me. I could no longer hear such conversations without thinking of the signs I had received. If the word unity had been shown to me, it was because my own interior was divided. I returned to my quarters with a clear feeling. The life I had built until then was a polished narrative, but incomplete. The medals, the protocols, the trust of the highest circles had defined me for decades. Yet faced with a message written by moving leaves, I understood that I needed to rewrite my story. I could no longer live only as the royal pilot. It was time to confront myself as a man. That night I lay down unable to close my eyes. Each time I thought of the leaves aligning, I felt as though I had glimpsed my reflection in an invisible mirror. Buckingham had shown not only the pomp everyone else saw, but the fracture only I carried. I told no one what I had witnessed. How could I? Who would believe it? I chose to keep the episode silent, like a personal mark. But inside there was no longer any way to deny it. A greater force was calling me, one that bowed neither to crowns nor hid behind titles. That garden had taught me more than any flight manual. I had learned that true unity does not come from political treaties, but from something much deeper, invisible and absolute. From that point on, I knew my days as the impeccable pilot were numbered. The palace would still call me for prestigious missions, but my heart had already begun to answer another summons. That night, the pilot's quarters at Northolt were almost deserted. The heavy silence of the hallways contrasted with the frantic routine of flight days. I entered the simple room waiting for me, a narrow bed, a worn wooden table, a metal wardrobe that already knew the weight of my suitcases. There, for the first time in years, there was no pomp, no protocols, no crowns to distract me. Only myself, my baggage, and a throbbing conscience. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened the suitcase, and stared at the decorations I carried as proof of decades of loyalty and discipline. Shining medals, each one representing completed missions, successful operations, unshakable trust. But in that instant, they no longer gleamed as before. They were pieces of metal that suddenly weighed like stones. I held them in my hands and realized that much of my identity had been built around symbols that no longer answered the questions haunting me. Slowly, I removed all the insignias and placed them on the table. The gesture was more than organizing baggage, it was an unmasking. Along with them, I set aside the vanity that had always accompanied me. the irony I often used to hide my doubts, and the hardness I had worn like armor to survive among the powerful. For the first time, I felt I didn't need to represent anything. I bent my knees on the cold floor of the quarters. There was no music, no speeches, no audience, only the echo of my breathing. My voice came out trembling, almost a whisper, but steady enough to speak the words that would transform my existence. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasul Allah. I bore witness to the oneness of God and recognized the messenger. There were no bursts of light, no supernatural effects. What happened was even more striking. The same luminous silence that had accompanied me since the first sign settled again, but this time inside me. It was as if that narrow space had expanded, revealing a peace I had never known in palaces or cockpits. I remained prostrated for a few minutes, trying to grasp what had just happened. I, who had always measured my life by protocols and orders, had just taken the greatest commitment of all without witnesses, without official documents, without a commander to sign. Only myself and the one who had always been beyond the skies I had flown. I rose a different man. The first sensation was lightness, as though part of the weight on my shoulders had been lifted. The second was caution. I knew very well where I was. The machinery of the system does not tolerate course changes without a flight plan. A conversion like mine, if revealed, would be treated as betrayal. The trust I had been given could easily turn into suspicion, so I decided to remain silent. I would keep that night as an intimate secret, a turning point known only to me and to God. I continued performing my duties with the same rigor, smiling at banquets, greeting officers, adjusting cockpit controls, but deep down, everything had changed. The medals returned to the suitcase, but they no longer carried the same pride. They were now reminders of a journey that had led me to the floor of that room. I needed no stage to fall, no audience to rebuild myself. My collapse had no witnesses, yet from it was born the deepest freedom I had ever experienced. And though no one suspected, I knew a new flight had begun, unseen by human radars but recorded on the eternal map. The change began almost imperceptibly. First came the interviews called routine. Long questionnaires, circular questions, looks that felt more like interrogations than simple evaluations. I already knew that game. When an officer begins to be closely observed, it means absolute trust has given way to a shadow of suspicion. My superiors never accused me of anything, but every word I spoke seemed weighed on a scale. Then came the withdrawn invitations. Dinners where my seat had always been reserved now took place without my name on the list. Official trips, once announced as a guaranteed honor, were suddenly assigned to other colleagues. The space that once opened automatically for my presence now closed in silence. I was still a pilot, but no longer the pilot, and to my surprise, instead of revolt, what I felt was relief. During this process, Yusuf was also reassigned. The official justification was need at another base, but we both knew the real reason. He paid the price for having come too close. His transfer was painful for me, like losing an ally in hostile territory. Still, his memory stayed with me. The words spoken in the hangar, "When the cockpit goes quiet, some hear what has always been there," now sounded like a fulfilled prophecy. As for me, the solution was relocation. I left behind the spotlight of state flights and was sent to discreet routes, many of them humanitarian operations. For some, this meant demotion. For me, it was a new runway to begin again. I was far from crowns and pomp, but closer to something I had always missed: peace. On one of those missions, I flew an air bridge to transport refugees from a conflict zone. The plane was far from the comfort of royal cabins, makeshift seats, belongings reduced to bags, faces marked by pain. And yet, there was a quiet dignity among those people that moved me deeply. During boarding, a girl of perhaps 6 years old, wearing worn clothes and with a curious look, walked past me and without hesitation called me brother. She didn't know my name, didn't know my story, had no idea who I had been. She simply recognized me as part of something greater, as if my secret conversion had spilled beyond the uniform. That simple gesture undid me. There was the answer that entire palaces had never given me. It wasn't the honor of carrying kings and queens that defined my life, but the ability to serve those who had nothing to offer in return. In that instant, I understood that true royalty does not depend on crowns, but on the courage to be useful without applause. The 3 signs that had followed me, the golden light in the skies of Scotland, the impossible recitation in Marrakesh, and the word formed by the leaves in Buckingham, now closed like a circuit. All pointed in the same direction. I had not been called to protect thrones, but to recognize the sovereignty of the one above all thrones. As I adjusted the controls for takeoff with those fragile passengers on board, I realized my biography was taking a new route. I had lost privileges but gained freedom. The man once watched by crowns was now called brother by strangers, and paradoxically, it was in this demotion that I found the greatest ascension. The clash of worlds continued. On one side, suspicion and distance. On the other, signs and rediscovery. But I already knew which runway to choose, and that new direction, though discreet, carried the weight of eternity. Today, every day is an exercise in relearning. After years of measuring my life by military schedules and flight protocols, learning to pray again feels like discovering a new rhythm to exist. It's no longer about repeating memorized formulas, but about making room within me to listen, give thanks, and seek guidance. Each prayer is like aligning the instruments before takeoff. Without it, I risk losing the route. Study has become another essential part of this process. Once I took pride in collecting technical manuals and confidential reports, but now I face the humility of opening the Quran and admitting I am only a learner. Verse after verse, I discover that wisdom is not hidden in inaccessible codes, but offered directly, as if written for the human heart in its simplicity. It is not studied to prove superiority, but to transform me. Part of this path involves recognizing old mistakes. My irony and sarcasm, once used as shields against any questioning, left marks on those close to me. Today I carry the responsibility of asking forgiveness, not only with words, but through actions. I seek to repair, whenever possible, the wounds I caused to colleagues, family, and even strangers who received from me a harsh look when what they needed was understanding. It is silent work, but as necessary as any mission I ever flew. If once I was driven by the desire for public recognition, now I learn the value of gestures no one applauds. Helping quietly, listening without hurry, guiding someone without expecting anything in return, all of this teaches me that greatness is not found in royal halls, but in living with integrity, even without an audience. It is a daily commitment to something greater than myself, a commitment that transcends ranks and uniforms. I also feel the responsibility to share my story, not to exalt myself, but to show that transformation is possible in any context, even in the most closed corridors of power. I know my story may reach people who, like I once did, carry doubts in silence and believe there is no way out. With each testimony, I think perhaps there is someone on the other side of the screen who needs exactly this reminder, that it is always possible to begin again. And here, I make a sincere request. If this story spoke to your heart, if in any way it brought reflection or hope, consider using Super Thanks. That financial contribution helps the channel take stories like mine to many more people, keeping alive work that does not belong only to me, but that can reach hearts I could never reach alone. It is not an obligation, just a way to multiply the impact of what you have just heard. I carry gratitude for each person who takes time to listen until the end. The simple fact that someone listens is already in itself a gift, but when this testimony becomes a bridge to touch other lives, gratitude turns into responsibility, not for fame or prestige, but for the duty to be faithful to the call I received. Today, when I look back, I clearly see the line that connects each sign, the golden light in the sky of Scotland, the recitation in Marrakesh, the word formed by the leaves in Buckingham. They were not given to me to keep only for myself, but to share with others who may be waiting for a sign in their own journeys. Gratitude and responsibility. These are the two words guiding my steps now. Gratitude for having been reached when I least expected it, and responsibility in not letting this transformation become only a memory. If you have stayed with me this far, you are already part of this story. And together, we can make sure it reaches even more people who need to hear that there is always a new route, even when everything seems closed. I realize that true value is not in palaces, insignias, or titles I once carried. What transforms life is the ability to hear what cannot be measured or displayed in showcases. Just a single moment of sincere attention is enough to change the entire course. That's how it was with me, and that's how it can be with anyone. I want to leave here a simple request. Share this video in groups and on social media. The gesture may seem small, but it may be exactly what someone needs to find strength, direction, or hope. You never know how far a word can reach when you decide not to keep it only for yourself. Watch the next video as well. Each experience shared here is an opportunity for reflection, an invitation to look beyond the surface and notice signs that often go unnoticed in the rush of daily life. May this message find in you not just a spectator, but someone willing to carry forward what touches and transforms. Share it, stay with us, and allow more people to discover through a simple minute of listening that there is always a new path waiting to be walked.